Welcome to the Uncut Podcast. I'm Pastor Luke.
I am Pastor Cameron.
And this is the Uncut Podcast, where we have honest, uncut conversations about faith, life, and ministry. Cameron was trying so hard to not cough into the microphone.
Sorry,
as we
friends.
did that intro.
Sorry about that.
So we're sitting down, and we saw a interesting piece of social media the other day that sparking lots of conversation in its own right, and like it's where it was posted and all of that, and we just thought it'd be an interesting conversation to have because it's, I don't know, I feel like I've seen a number of, there's that one documentary that you and I both have been following. It's kind of quote unquote making of. It's like an independent documentary of some, like, I can't even remember what it's called, but like
Religion as Business.
Religion as Business, which I don't know a ton. It just seems like some ex-church people or ex-pastors.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily ex-religious. They're just,
It's taking a I don't want to say defamatory because I haven't watched it, so I don't really know.
they haven't finished it yet.
But it's taking a very critical look at from the standpoint of like, do we really understand how churches operate and to what level they are businesses rather than religious organizations?
Yeah. And that's kind of a topic that's been in mainstream news, even, that show that with the British guy, last week tonight or something like that with John Oliver. Yeah. It's like a comedian. He does like comedian, like kind of like the Jon Stewart show or like the Daily, whatever those shows used to be. So a mixture of stand-up comedy and news reporting, Exposé type of thing. Kind of like Adam Ruins Everything back when that was like really common. So he did one maybe a year ago, maybe 2 years ago. If you like Google it, you could find it. He did one exposing churches and kind of made this kind of like essentially this argument that churches should lose their tax exemption status because of the way they use money. So it's something that's like people have been and continue to be and will continue to be critical of churches and how they use their money. So, do you want to tell us a little bit about the video I sent you over?
So there was a video where a guy who does a lot of church marketing, advertising, social media, web stuff, digital space, Brady Shearer,
who we both follow and
I think
pay attention to.
I think he does great stuff. I would say that he is like in service to the church. He wants to make churches online spaces better. Yeah. And everything that is involved in that. He runs an organization called Pro Church Tools. Super good, high quality stuff. Yeah. He made a video highlighting some of the results of the National Study of Congregations Economic Practices, nscep.org. That in his video he highlighted the gross as in whole, not in like icky. Right. The gross percentages.
The big picture.
The big picture percentages of how it was determined that churches spend their money.
Right. He didn't, just for note, he didn't actually say anything in the video about it, right? He's just like, here's the numbers from this website. And then he kind of just invited his viewers to have a discussion about it.
In the comments.
And I looked on his feed. He hadn't posted any follow-up where he gives his take. I'm sure that give it a week or two, he probably will put out a blog or a video and talk more in depth about his personal opinions about it, his hot take. But he didn't say anything about it. So he just put the numbers there, and then the comments were just people reacting to that.
Yeah, and some of them were positive, and some of them were really negative, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And I think it's, probably a lot of it is just based on your perspective, where you sit. Mm-hmm. What window are you looking out of? Mm-hmm. So what's the landscape you're going to see?
Yeah.
So the percentages were essentially, I don't know the sample size of churches, and I don't know what their requirements were, or whatever. Yeah. These are just what was shared in the video.
Right.
49% of a church's budget in this study had gone towards personnel. Mm-hmm. 23% towards facility. So that right there is a 72% of a church's budget goes towards personnel and facilities.
Yep.
Call it overhead if you want. I don't know. But then 11% on missions, 10% on programs, and then 7% on admin, which he said was essentially like a catch-all category, or like a miscellaneous category.
Right.
Where does the numbers fit when there's no place else for the numbers to fit?
Right.
And so the reactions to those percentages were wide and varied. And so I thought maybe, why don't we just talk a little bit about that today?
Yeah.
There had been, I think that earlier in ministry for me, meaning years ago, there was kind of there was a generalized understanding of, if your church intends to be financially healthy, what would be appropriate percentages to be represented in overhead expense.
Yeah.
And one of the most significant, what could be called overhead expenses in the church is personnel costs.
Yeah.
So that would be salaries, taxes for those salaries, because the church pays self-employed. We're an employer just like any other employer. We have employees. Taxes and any insurances associated with that, workers' comp and disability and all that. Any other fringe benefits to employees, salaries or healthcare or retirement benefits, anything like that.
Yeah.
And the general understanding was that the closer that you can get that number to between 42 and 45%, the better.
Yeah.
That is kind of like the standard rule of thumb.
Yep.
And so I'm not really surprised to see this number at 49%.
No.
At all.
Me neither.
I think that the question is, the question for me has always been, what is your perspective on the role of personnel within the church?
Right.
And because and perspective varies really widely. I've had people, when they find out, for instance, what I make, what the church pays me as a salary, I've had people be really offended in both directions.
Offended that it was too much and offended that it was so little?
Yes. Yeah. I've had people say, oh, it must be nice to be a pastor.
Okay.
That's a topic for another podcast. And then I've had people on the other side say that seems low given the responsibility that you have.
Yeah.
The education you have,
right.
The experience you have. So opinions vary.
Yes.
On that. Mm-hmm. They vary. But my opinion is that it is a little bit of a red herring to talk about personnel costs outside of the conversation about talking about missional or theological attachment to those costs.
Yeah.
And what I mean by that is that because then now you're going to look at these percentages and say, well, a church only spends 11% on missions.
Right.
The word missions is really vast, and lots of people have, like, what does even that mean? Like, does this mean, like, money that it sends to missionaries? Does this mean it's the whole of its outreach budget, outreach locally, regionally,
right,
internationally? Does this include, what does this include for, like, if the church has an evangelism, any type of evangelistic ministry or discipleship ministry or anything like that?
Yep.
Is that included in missions, or is that included in programs? Or is it included, as I think it is, in personnel?
Right.
Because
is the assumption that your staff, we're just paying our staff to sit in the room and not
do ministry. Right. So I always tell people that personnel expenses are ministry expenses.
Right.
That's money that is expended towards mission, counseling, evangelism, discipleship, the teaching of the word, the leading of worship,
right,
the praying over the sick. That 49% that seems like such a bloated number in the budget actually represents the largest percentage or capacity of missional or ministry expense that a church has.
Right.
And so I think that numbers like this are a little deceiving because it assumes a description of a business model where let's say we're just we're a family-run business, and it's a for-profit business, and it pays its employees 49% of its budget.
Right.
Virtually no one would say, "Oh yeah, that's too much."
No, it depends on, like, so I have a little bit of extra perspective. I've did some reading recently on a book called Profit First, which is a model of running your small business finances. And he essentially, like, it's a little bit of like mental finagling, how you view finances inside of a small business, but also the big portion of it is that it lands with these are generally recommended healthy percentages to be used on certain categories, operating expenses, personnel expenses, and things like that, for different size businesses. And those percentages, they don't really overlap too much, except for the facilities, the admin, and the personnel, like programs, and because there's no profit, right? So there's not a thing. But the personnel expenses and then the costs of operating are all pretty doggone close to what is recommended for even just a small business to operate in. But then here's the other thing too, is that if you were to look at, it's a little bit of a matter of scale. If you were to look at like a small church, right? Like maybe 100, 150 people, one person on staff, or maybe 1.5, right? One person full-time staff, presumably a senior pastor, someone who's like part-time secretary. That's that's a significant amount of churches throughout the United States fit that model. I would wager that their expense category on personnel is above 50%, probably.
Probably, yeah.
And that's just because there's less money in the pot overall. If there was more money, if the church was bigger and had more money to deal, the percentages would do. So there's a little bit of a matter of scale that comes into play with each congregation and each church.
Yeah. I think one of the, maybe I'll just pose this as a question.
Yeah.
Is the church a business?
I don't think so.
No, I don't think so either.
Why?
Does the church utilize some business practices?
Yeah.
Yeah. And are those two things different?
Yes.
Yeah. Right.
Right. But because what makes a nonprofit versus for-profit, right? Like, what's the difference there? Like, we're a profit business is always concerned about like the bottom line, right? Yeah. And how much can we do? How much product can we sell? And have the most amount of money left over after we finished selling our product, whatever that is, whether that's a service or whatever. For us, if we want to be financially responsible, right? We don't want to always be running like right at the line so that like if something catastrophic were to happen, the church like falls under because it doesn't have money to pay the bills. But if we have so much left over and we're like, yay, like we're actually probably failing at what we're supposed to be doing because money unspent is ministry undone.
Yeah.
And so like a church that is just squirreling away, what would classically be called profit and just sits in a bank account that doesn't have a plan, doesn't have a purpose, is just kind of sitting there for the accruement of it. That's ministry that could be done to people or done with people for people through the church. That's just not being done.
Right. And I will tell you that there's nothing like there are many nonprofits in the world that make a profit.
Yes.
It's not the term nonprofit is like just like the wording that the IRS uses to determine who has 501c3 status or not, which is really just a particular tax
classification,
tax classification, right, rather than a permission or not permission to actually be in the black, be even, or be red at the end of the year. So I think that there's a little bit of I think it's a little bit of it's misleading to say that the church is not a business, because I think what the assumption there is that because the church has at the center of its purposefulness in the most broad terms, religious orientation or goals or philosophy or mission or whatever, then it therefore should operate not as a business, but it should have some kind of like higher standard upon which it operates. But then
we feel
it really doesn't allow the church to manage or organize itself in a responsible way.
Right.
Right. Like I would think that most people would want churches to be well run, using appropriate business practices that are contextual for an organization like ours.
Right.
Right.
Well, like, for example, like let's say we're like, all right, our goal is to, at the end of each month or each quarter or whatever, have zero money in the balance, right? We're spending it all, and then and it's all being used, it's all being sent out, whatever. Like, we're essentially setting the church to live paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
And to put it in personal finance terms.
Right.
But then let's say the economy drops and then the church and people stop giving as much or whatever, right? Something happens that affects the income of the church, or the roof falls in, something happens that there's this big expense that the church suddenly has to, and church is like, well, we don't have anything to help buffer that. We have to close our doors. And all of a sudden the congregation is like, well, why did our church close down? Well, we had this philosophy that like we felt like it was sinful or wrong to have any money left over as like a buffer for expenses and operating, and so we never had any saved.
Right. We didn't want to we didn't want to be a business. We didn't want to act like a business.
We didn't want to act like a business.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty irresponsible, particularly like if the congregation wants the church to continue to be around, right. Even if, there's a year or two of hard finances. Mm-hmm. So, and then there's a line at which like, okay, at what point are we saving to be responsible and saving just for like an emotional reason or for
like security
reason,
right?
Or for like a reason that is no longer in line with, with what we feel like we ought to be doing with that money. But you want the church to continue to be here. The church has to operate in a way that allows it to be more stable.
Yeah. Yeah. Most people would say that, we'd like to go to a church that has a roof on it.
Right.
And that is climate controlled in some ways, has a heater in the winter or AC in the summer, or that has power and the lights are on. It's not just dark, or
has a bathroom inside.
Has a bathroom, right? Like all those are facility costs, and they're the cost of operating and being able to offer ministry to people.
Yeah.
And so it, like this building that we're in now, is a nice building. Mm-hmm. It's big. It fits. It's maybe a little bit small for our size. Like we could stand to have a little bit more space. And but like as a responsible financial practice, like we made efforts to pay this building off, and so it's like debt free, and we have tried over the years to do infrastructure updates to it to make sure that we're protecting our investment, new roofs, new heating system, cooling system, gradually replacing windows, parking lot, things like that, so that we can use the facility in a way that allows us opportunity to be in ministry to people here in our region. So even the 23% on facilities, I'm like, well, why do you need that? Well, we don't need it.
Yeah, I mean, we could do church in the dark.
Yeah, we could do church in a tent out front, like we
just did.
We could do church a lot of different ways, but just because we have it doesn't necessarily mean that we're somehow like not fulfilling our role or purpose of the church, because we do have expenses that are similar to or exactly like a business. We're not a business primarily.
No,
we're not. We're the community of believers in Jesus Christ here, but we utilize business practices in order to ensure that we're living with integrity as to the resources that have been entrusted to us.
Yeah.
So we manage our money, and we have budgets, and we save when we can, and we spend a lot of money in ministry and mission, of which is included personnel who work directly with people for the purposes of their salvation.
Yeah.
I will be interested to see what that documentary is like.
Yeah.
In some of the small clips that I've seen on it, I do notice that a lot of their criticism, of their reporting is done towards the Mormon Church.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Yeah.
Which is like, I don't know, it's some crazy stat.
They're
like the fourth largest landowner in the United States.
Yep. I remember that.
Yeah, and
they buy up a lot of land, and and they just kind of hold on to it.
Right, and so they're at the value of their assets is in the billions of dollars. But they enjoy
tax exempt status. So they own all of that property but don't pay any taxes on it. Right.
Yeah.
in this conversation is a really tricky thing, is because in some people's minds, like when, like, I don't know, if we were to just walk up, we were dropped out of context. We were not in Jamestown. We were just in some random city, walked up to some random person. And we just kind of like went up to a line of people and we said, we're pastors. Draw a picture of what you think that means, what we look like, what like our lifestyle looks like. You'll get two very different pictures. Mm-hmm. One would be maybe informed by like childhood experience or experience in a local church of like, that's of small to medium, moderate in size, like something like us, maybe a little bit smaller, maybe a little bit bigger, but they would kind of draw kind of some sort of picture. That kind of typified by when my wife started telling people that she was engaged and getting married to a pastor, she got a lot of comments of like you're never going to make any money. You're never going to be able to go on vacations, say goodbye to like nice things. You know, like a lot of people made a lot of assumptions that, you know, me and my wife were going to be like two steps from like being poverty, being in a cardboard box or something like that. And that's not true, but that is kind of the extreme of the one end, is that this, you know, pastors as kind of just average normal people, or even people who are sometimes making less than the average person. And then the other end of the spectrum would be people's like typified by like, oh, well, that means you're going to have like really expensive clothes and you're going to have a house that's like a mansion all paid for by the church. And like, you're going to like be this kind of like minor celebrity and like this huge kind of mega church image that gets painted. Mm-hmm. And the thing is that the mega church pastor is the minority of pastors, but gets the majority of the attention. Yeah. And so people are like, well, you know, we really should be paying our pastors less. But what they're saying, what they have in their mind as they're talking about, is they're picturing one or two or four celebrity pastors who come into their mind, right? Mm-hmm. Who just live these extravagant lifestyles. And what they're ignoring is they're ignoring the other 99% of pastors who make a living salary that's probably around the medium of whatever the community that they live in. Mm-hmm. And that's where this conversation gets kind of polarized, I think, is wanting to kind of legislate and control or dominate like the perceived lifestyle of the minority without any consideration of the majority. Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I can add a single thing to that. I agree. Yeah. Completely. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I like, as people were kind of reacting really strongly to the like, oh, I can't believe the church spends so little on missions. Right? That was one of the sentiments that was expressed in the comments of that video. And you kind of were hinting at it at the beginning, kind of with your like, well, is not missions what the church does, period.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I do think that that there's a little bit of a presupposition that is being bought into subtly. And we've kind of just been talking about it without naming it, but it's this presupposition that the church having money is a bad thing.
Right.
That's kind of this, and I think that's maybe brought on by like exposés and like, you know, documentaries and stuff that are highlighting the excesses and the abuses of some of this in certain pastors or certain ministries. Mm-hmm. But it's coming to this just like, oh, well, the church having money is a bad thing. The church, it was interesting. Some of the comments were just like, wow, our churches really should be tithing better.
Tithing to where?
Exactly. That there's this assumption that the church having money to spend on ministry, on its goals of advancing the gospel, of preaching and discipling and baptizing people and teaching them to obey all things in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, is not a thing Like, that's not enough. The church needs to also be giving away its money elsewhere. I'm not saying that churches can't do that or shouldn't do it, but the assumption that the church should also be, it's kind of this like assumption that the church is not enough, is not the end goal of the kingdom of God to begin with, and that it has to be going somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like passages in Acts, the book of Acts, where it's really clear that even like from time to time people sold a plot of land and they brought the money and they placed it at the feet of the apostles. Right. Like that it was pretty well established principle that even from the beginning of the church that they were a receiver of they were a receiver of funds, ostensibly so that they could be a user of funds. Right. So that, but it's not as if like this, we talk about like, oh, the church has so much money. It's not as if like the church just goes out there and does shady business deals and takes it from people. No. Right? At its core, the church has money because the people who are the church have determined that the pooling of their resources for the mission of that specified church is important to them. So they create a kitty, essentially. And then they agree upon how that money is going to be spent. Yes. In most cases, right? And in really all cases, in some way, shape, or form. And so then they go about spending that money, which is their money. In the way that they've decided is important to them. Yes. Okay. I guess the question that most people who have a difficulty with this is like, well, doesn't the church guilt people into giving them money? And I would say, in all honesty, some churches do. Some pastors do. You know, they leverage, they try to leverage the scriptures to include, you know, like a theological belief that that blessing, personal blessing and favor follows those who give extravagantly to the Lord, extravagantly to the church. Okay. Does that happen? Yeah, of course.
But it's not a vending machine.
It's not. No, and it's also not a universal principle. Like you said, it's kind of the same thing as the conversation around it's kind of the same thing as the conversation around celebrity pastor salaries. Is that you can't take the small sample size and apply it to the whole and expect it to be true. Additionally, there are I learned this in seminary, actually. Yeah. So I went to seminary in Dayton, Ohio, which has a much higher, which is a much more diverse area than I live and grew up in Western New York. You know, there's a greater percentage of African Americans that live there, and they really wouldn't consider themselves like. There's no place in Ohio is considered like down south, but
I mean, we get a little Appalachian.
But some of the cultural values in the African American church are a lot different than cultural values in white churches. And one of their cultural values is that their pastors are extraordinarily well paid and they desire pastors to live what may look like, it's usually not, but what may look like extravagant lifestyles. Very well dressed.
a decent car,
very nice cars.
Yeah.
Right. Expensive jewelry for pastor and first lady of the church.
Yep.
Right. Not because it's out of like, not because it's out of like greed at all, but because they have a cultural value, which I understand and appreciate. They have a cultural value of seeing the pastor be honored by its congregation, be honored extravagantly in their salary or payment or whatever to that pastor, that they are in keeping with like the scripture, they are worthy of double honor.
Right.
They have plowed the grain. So we shouldn't muzzle that ox. He should eat from the grain that he plows from.
Right.
And that really in the African American church is not a questioned value at all.
No.
That's a well accepted value.
Yeah.
Right.
And I can even think of the opposite because I have friends who are in the Asian American church, and it is the opposite.
It's a vow of poverty.
It's a vow of poverty.
Sure.
They become concerned if their pastors make too much. Like they would much rather their pastors live at or below where the rest of the congregation makes.
Yeah.
And it's not, I don't think it's quite as explicit. It kind of just happens that way, at least in the handful of Asian American congregations I've interacted with which is actually more than 3. So like, but it was true at each one. And so there's a spectrum there. But sorry, I didn't mean to finish.
No, I think that, you know, like, and I think a lot of white churches maybe kind of fall. You see it. I mean, like there's churches of all cultural backgrounds on all sides of those spectrums, of course, but and a lot of it is relative as well.
Yeah,
you know, a pastor living near the poverty line in Southern California who's Asian, high Asian population in Southern California or in the Bay Area, even San Francisco area, whatever, they probably make a lot more than I do.
Right.
I don't live near the poverty line here.
No.
But I'm also not like considered wealthy.
Right.
Even close.
Yeah.
Right. So it's like the perspective, geographical areas, life situations are all, they can all kind of, they all matter in that conversation.
What do you say to the person who says, well, pastors should either be bivocational or they should just have another job so that the church does not pay them? What do you say to someone who kind of says that? Like you should be bivocational so that the church doesn't have to pay you.
I would say that's a fair ask. As long as the person understands the consequences of a pastor who's not solely focused on ministry in that church. Like if you're going to say to your pastor, you need to get another job or you should have another job so the church doesn't pay you, you can't also say to your pastor, we expect you to be at every meeting, to visit everyone in the hospital, to be at the bedside of every sick person or dead person.
Call.
Do every funeral, every wedding, be on call, show up, do the Sunday morning stuff, do the Wednesday evening stuff, run the youth group, like all of that. Like you have to understand that they have a biblical requirement also to provide for their family,
right? And
their very own needs by the work of their hands.
Yeah,
And so if you're going to say like, yeah, you need to go make your living somewhere else, what you're saying is come do this for free, which is not a biblical principle. It's not a principle that even Jesus himself said, that we see this in Jesus, we see it in Paul, that, do not muzzle the ox as it's treading the grain. Which is to say, as the ox runs around treading the grain of the ancient of in the ancient Near East.
It's pulling a grindstone around and around the circle.
Right.
Don't sweep up the grain so that the mocks can't stop every once in a while and eat a little bit.
Right, because they're doing the work. Mm-hmm. They are in the middle of the labor. They deserve part of the fruit of that labor.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's a short-sighted opinion to say to your pastor, you need to go get another job so that you can, so that we don't have to pay you. But that's also a different thing from saying, it's a different thing than maybe a pastor who chooses to do that.
Right, because I know some pastors who don't even like bivocational ministry. They like to call it co-vocational because they see it as part of a mission.
Sure.
They're like, I want to have 2 vocations so that I stay connected in the world, or they see it as a gift to the church, and that's great. Like I'm not trying. I wasn't asking the question to diss on like that model of church, because I think it works and is the right model for many churches and many pastors who feel called to it. But you're right.
I kind of diss on that model of church.
I mean, I'm not in it. I'm not in that model.
Well, I would say that the only time that that's appropriate is if the pastor chooses that for themselves, not ever if the church chooses that for the pastor.
Yeah.
But that's my opinion.
Yeah.
My opinion on it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's just like, it's because there are churches that have like, that pay nobody anything,
Are there certain denominations that do that? Is there,
yeah.
Is there a denomination that is like all of their pastors are lay?
Yes. The Plymouth Brethren.
Okay.
I think.
Why do I know someone, or we just had a conversation with someone who was like in a denomination where that was the case?
My wife, the churches she grew up in, which were Slavic American churches, they typically, not like across the board always, but they typically have no staff pastor. They have a single pastor, and then they have elders and deacons, but they don't pay any like singular person. And so then they'll have multiple people preach on a Sunday. There's, I think, Quakers. I don't even know if Quakers are still around. I think they probably are, just not in large amounts. Hipper church like house church models.
Okay.
I don't know if those are still thriving, but that kind of model was similar to, they generally had kind of convictions around that as well.
Right.
Kind of destructure the church. So
I feel like I was actually having a conversation with someone who ascribed to that model, or
really?
It'll come to me.
It's different. It's going to come, like you said, with different expectations. Like the church as a whole is going to have to carry more of the burden. Like as a whole, the expectations around what your pastors will and will not be able to do, simply because of the fact that they have full-time jobs in order to pay for themselves. It's going to make an impact on the way it kind of functions. So,
yeah. So the whole conversation is, it can be pretty extensive, I was doing, like, for this morning, I was doing budgeting here for us. Like, I was looking at our budget, looking at
seeing how we're doing so far.
Yep. Yeah. Just seeing what the numbers are, because we're literally halfway through the year.
I know. It's like August. We're supposed to start
budgeting for
the next year. So which by the way, our budget goes before the leadership team, which is made out of people who are part of the congregation, who then approve the budget.
Correct.
Right? It's not you and I just writing blank checks.
Right. Approve the spending, approve personnel costs, approve all of that. Yep. So, like it was part of my work today as pastor, and is preparing for a meeting later this week that I'll have to present some of that information to the congregation.
Yeah.
And, I think conversations like this are important because often things are kind of shrouded in a veil of mystery and questions.
Yeah.
And like information it's just not nuanced, I think, enough.
Yeah.
And so big, bold statements can be made, but that are not necessarily true. Like, oh my gosh, this church just pays 50% of all its money to people. Doesn't even do ministry with it. I think it's a statement that's really misleading.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. It's when you say it that way, like, oh my gosh, we're just giving money to the staff. Mm-hmm. Well, no, you're paying the staff to do things,
right.
To like perform duties as assigned
to carry out ministry.
Which those include, praying for people, preaching the word, running your kids' ministry, like any number of things that are ministry oriented, and like. It's not like you're literally just like we don't just walk in here and say, all right, I'm here to pick up my check. And then we just walk back out.
Right.
And then we not do anything.
Yeah. Let's work for 4 hours on a Sunday and that's it.
Yeah, that's it. That's all we really do. We just watch YouTube the rest of the week. We don't do anything else.
Well, if you guys have our listeners out there, viewers have any other questions about stuff like this or clarifications, maybe, always shoot them our way, either on our text line, 716-201-0507. Can't believe I remember that after a month off. Or drop them in the comments here. As always, if you would share this episode or the podcast with other people, you can like it in whatever platform that you're listening to it, or rate it, subscribe, comment, do all the things. That'd be a great help. And we'll catch you next week.